Hallo kijkers, hoe gaat het allemaal? Bij mij gaat het goed, dus ik ga nu GTA 5 doen. Dus daar gaan we dan. Nu gaan we dan bijna. Nu gaan we dan even nog iets doen. En kijkers. Reclame. Weet je iets? We gaan geen GTA 5 doen. We gaan een film kijken. Als je dat willen. Dus wat willen jullie? Willen jullie ook weer de Tweede Wereldoorlog laten zien? Of gewoon GTA 5 doen en shit? Dus welke zou ik doen? Ja. Dus hier gaan we dan bijna de controle pakken, ja natuurlijk. Ook even op de andere. We gaan een DVD kijken. Ja, ik ook dus. Dus ik ga ook kijken. Ja, dit is wel leuk. Die gaan we, kijkers, die gaan we kijken. Tweede Wereldoorlog. Ik ga even skippen. Oh nee, dit niet. Hier gaan we dan. Loga, denk ik.
The momentous events of the morning of the 7th of December 1941 were to have a profound effect on the eventual outcome of World War II. It was then, on what President Roosevelt called a day of infamy, that a huge force of Japanese aircraft attacked the unsuspecting US Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. During the devastating raid, 19 US ships were sunk and more than 2,000 US lives were lost. The die was cast. The United States was soon firmly in the war, and Japan had taken the first steps on the road that would ultimately lead to the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
In infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The origins of one of the most infamous episodes in military history can be traced back as far as the year 1905, and the unexpected Japanese naval victory over the Russians at Tsushima. The triumph there provided the Japanese with the encouragement they needed to accelerate the pace of the naval expansion that had begun almost 50 years earlier. Japan continued to build her navy until 1922, when the Washington Conference Treaty, signed by the United States, Great Britain and Japan, fixed the tonnage of capital ships and placed restrictions on warship construction by all three of these major naval powers. By the end of the 1930s, however, Japan was in the grip of fervent nationalism, and the world watched as political turmoil at home turned into outright aggression abroad. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria, an act carried out in defiance of the Japanese government by the all-powerful military, and which directly threatened the open-door policy of the United States towards China and its huge commercial markets. The US response, though, was weak, and emboldened by its success, Japan sought naval parity with the US at the 1934 London Naval Conference. When this was refused, she withdrew, abrogating all existing agreements and treaties, and within the year, the pace of Japanese shipbuilding had increased to such an extent that her navy posed a considerable threat to the mighty US fleet in the Pacific. While Japan eyed the riches of Eastern Asia, the USA continued to look inwards. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36 and 37 were passed by Congress in an attempt to keep the US out of any European war, reflecting the isolationist mood in the US at the time. The country received a jolt, however, when, in 1937, the Japanese further extended their Chinese interests by seizing Inner Mongolia and northern China. Perhaps the American people, who were largely sympathetic to the Chinese, expected something more than Roosevelt's famous conciliatory quarantine speech in October that year. Still, Japan persisted with her Chinese adventure, and by 1938 she controlled vast areas of the north and the center of that country. Not only this, but the methods of the Japanese army, which included the shelling of civilians, reached levels of savagery previously unseen. As a consequence, the public mood in the US turned from sympathy to outrage. But the pleas of the government for US manufacturers to place a moral embargo on Japan were hardly likely to halt the naked Japanese aggression. To add to US woes, the crisis in Europe also came to further help the Japanese in their territorial ambitions. In March 1939, Adolf Hitler's armies marched into Prague. As they did so, Japan invaded the island of Hainan. In 1940, the fall of France to the rampant Germans gave the Japanese an opportunity to march into French Indochina with the compliance of the Vichy government. Finally, the British were forced to close the Burma Road trade route to China in the same year. Events in both Japan and the USA were now moving as swiftly as those abroad. In July 1941, the USA placed a full trade embargo on Japan and froze her assets at home. In October 1941, Prince Konoe's largely moderate government fell, to be replaced by a new regime headed by the hawkish General Tojo. While in the USA, as the prospect of war loomed ever closer, Roosevelt wrestled with the twin problems of diplomatic necessity and military expediency. A final, unsuccessful attempt at mediation was made on November the 20th, 1941, a mere 6 weeks before the Pearl Harbor attack. War was now inevitable. The Japanese foreign minister even warned his ambassador in Washington that unless agreement could be reached before November the 29th, things were going to happen. In the USA, the reluctant American cabinet was still preoccupied with diplomatic procedure as it searched for a way to force Japan into opening hostilities without inflicting casualties or damage on US armed forces. Meanwhile, the American military was receiving decoded messages from the South Pacific that tragically it appeared to deem unimportant. Those messages carried warnings that the Japanese Air Force planned to strike first at the US naval base in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was Japan's greatest naval strategist, and the man who planned the raid on Pearl Harbor. Not only was he a vastly experienced naval officer who had fought against the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, but he had also spent time in the USA, firstly as a language student at Harvard University, and later as assistant naval attaché in Washington. His time in the US had imbued him with a healthy respect for the country that was now Japan's enemy, for he had seen at first hand America's enormous industrial manufacturing capabilities. Perhaps it was this that prompted the pragmatic Yamamoto to warn his countrymen during the early months of the war, "We can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that I have utterly no confidence." In 1940, Yamamoto was given command of the flagship Nagato and overall command of the Japanese combined fleet. Nagumo was in command of the first air fleet, known as Kido Butai, and directed operations from the carrier Akagi. Nagumo had only a limited experience of carrier-borne warfare and was also a very cautious man.
Dan
This
ga je niet
combination
stoppen.
persuaded him
Doei!
not to